Hello, welcome everybody to another show, another Friday Drinks, here with my good friends. I think we haven't done this in a while, so welcome and thank you very much for joining us. I think this is a double occasion because it's two shows in one day. Producer, what's actually happening?
It just shows you that the show is growing. So there was a time when we were struggling for content. We are at a point where we have so much of content because there's a lot of things that is happening, but also because there's so many guests that now want to come onto the show. So maybe it made sense to have one show per week on a Friday at 3 p.m. But you know what? It just tells you that the future we could be actually having more.
Is this guy now politically correct? I thought it was a very simple matter that we had a midterm review.
Yes, exactly.
People wanted a show where we actually look at the midterm.
Yeah,
budget. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no. I'm the producer of the show, so obviously.
So you're just taking
I'm the adult. I know what's good for the show.
You're just promoting the show, basically.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
And
All right.
obviously
Sorry, my bad.
So look, we have tons and tons of content. Rufaro and I were in Vic Falls.
Yeah. Tell me about that. How was Victoria Falls?
Look, it was so this was my first time, my first outing with the accountants. Oh gosh, they love having fun, those people.
All right.
they were so relaxed. I think that's probably one occasion where they get to loosen up. They're always very serious, those accountants. I don't know how you guys are trained, Rufaro. But
would you like to indulge us in what exactly happened in Victoria Falls?
Well, you know what they say
Why
about...
is he so giddy?
You know what they say about Vegas.
Well, this wasn't Vegas.
What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
But
But it was good fun.
Yeah, very good fun, yeah.
It really is a majestic town. It's a pleasant respite from, the traffic jams that we're suffering from here in Harare. And I think, there's just something about being in a resort that loosens you up and people, put their hair down or let their hair down. And, we had some really interesting conversations.
Yeah.
And I think we premiered...
You did it again.
Yeah, we premiered the minister. We had him for a whole episode.
And what were your thoughts afterwards?
Look, I think he's progressive. I think he's open to engagement. I think... that was my biggest takeaway, that we can engage and actually get things done.
And this has been the theme of this show from when it started, that there was a huge gap between business and government. And so one of the objectives of this show has been to try and close that gap.
Bridge the gap.
Yeah, bridge the gap. So whenever we've got an opportunity to speak to people in government, we always take it. Obviously, we are doing that without losing our identity as it were. But I would say maybe at the core of our DNA has been to try and bridge that gap.
So what was your biggest takeaway from actually talking to David?
So the biggest takeaway is there are people in government that are willing to listen to what business say, their business views. They may agree or disagree with it, but at least the information
they're available for the conversation.
Available for a conversation, and you then feel that maybe with this further engagement, whatever mistrust that was there or perception of mistrust that was there between business and government, I think over time is likely to improve.
So Rufaro, why is it not filtering? Why is it the engagement is not filtering through in government policy and in government presentations?
Yeah, look, so I think it's what you're speaking to, if I were to distill it to one word, is inertia. I think the government is used to a certain way of doing business, and actually changing that is incredibly difficult. I think this is what we've gotten wrong many times. Well, I'm particularly guilty of this, where we get excited sometimes when there are announcements that the people crossing the ledger from the private sector to go and work in government, and we know some of these people personally, and we think that they will change the way government does business. and almost inevitably we're disappointment with the pace of change. So I think it's a matter of inertia. I think the government is it's a huge organization, and it's been doing things in a particular way over the last 4 decades. And, I would hazard to say, even if you were to join government tomorrow as at a very senior level, we might actually be incredibly disappointed.
Well, to be clear, that will never happen. Just to be very clear.
Never say never.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are certain things that we, at least, no one says, well, I hope not. No one says I'm going to go to hell. Mm-hmm. That I'm intentionally
but this will be an opportunity for you to save your country.
No, to me, this is the best way in which I'm actually serving my country. Because to me, as libertarians, and I'm more anarchist than he is.
No, you're anarchist. I'm not the least bit anarchist. But maybe you could just explain to our audience what we mean by in the libertarian camp, what we mean by who are the anarchists.
So the anarchists don't believe in having a state, having a government, having the executive branch of government. That it's very possible for us to do away with the executive arm of government.
This is why they are appropriately called anarchists, because in a state that actually used to that, you'd have anarchy, surely.
No, that's not that's the colloquial meaning of anarchy is chaos.
Yes.
But anarchy, a libertarian anarchist does not mean chaos, because we still believe in the rule of law.
Yeah.
We just don't believe in a group of men ruling over us.
Men and women. You have to.
Well, men in as holistic as possible.
So in that utopian...
it's not utopian.
It's dystopian in my view.
Oh, okay.
It's not utopian, no.
Okay.
Dystopian. It's actually... Well, okay, so you might actually understand this. It's the rule of judges. So if you remember, beyond Joshua, right, we had the rule of the judges. So there was no king.
Okay.
Right, the first king, and if you think about it, was 400 years. And if you look at the Israelites, that's when they occupied Canaan, right? So what you term land of milk and honey, there was no land of milk and honey when they occupied it. It was dry land, right? It was fertile land, but there was not much of that. But during the era of the judges is where the development happened. So that by the time you have the first king, right, Saul, he was ruling over a land that was actually way more developed. And that happened during the rule of the judges. And the rule of the judges is precisely that. There was rule of law. But you just didn't have one dominant party or one dominant individual.
So in modern history, which country comes to mind which is closer to...
So when you look at the United States... When you look at the United States of America, if you remember when it started, these were different states. So when you look at the Quakers,
the 13 colonies,
the Quakers, Pennsylvania for the longest was an anarchist state, and they didn't have a dominant government power in power. China, for example, in its glory years, a lot of the ancient Chinese era. When you think about it, it was anarchist as well. Okay. It just means that you don't have one central government that rules over the people. It doesn't mean you don't have courts. It doesn't mean that you don't have rule of law. You actually have rule of law. So if you think about it, a lot of the things, and I'll come back to you because I think this is something that might actually excite you. If you look at most of the disputes, legal disputes, they're resolved in arbitration. You don't actually go through court, right?
Commercial disputes.
A lot of the commercial disputes, which are outside of the state. Mm-hmm. But remember, the difference between criminal and commercial is purely because a group of men decided what was criminal and what was civil. Mm-hmm. It's not. There's no jurisprudence that we can sit here and think, oh, that was clever. I think that needs to be criminal and this needs to be civil. It's just that some men sat, and here they were literally men, and
decided that this is criminal.
This is criminal and this is civil. But if you think about it, a lot of the arbitration that happens, both sides are actually, they put themselves under a particular law, and it is binding in a lot of ways. So that's actually what I believe in. libertarian. But I can hear the argument, and I can hear the argument from Rufaro, which is small government. So I think that when you read the theory around libertarian views, there is the idea of a small government. And I buy into that as well.
Yeah. So, and to answer Ranga's question, on the global stage today, I think Javier Milei in Argentina is libertarian. He's cut the size of government. He's actually balanced the budget for the first time in decades in Argentina.
Absolutely.
And, I'm absolutely delighted just watching him at work and, changing how government does business over there. And, if you look at the United States and, the first 100 years, they had a really small government. In fact,
Washington.
Up until 1900, taxes in the US were about 1%.
Well, there were no taxes. There was no income tax at all until 1913. In fact, the 3rd of October, 1913 is when they introduced 1% tax, income tax. And you know what happened?
Mm-hmm. There were riots. Right? So and this is a country that,
1%.
was growing steadily.
100 years ago, a government... But
anyway, so it is possible to have.
They should come back to today now.
So it is possible to have.
Much higher.
It is possible to have small budget, and it is possible to balance budgets, and this is actually a great way to segue into the conversation.
Actually, today's conversation,
because we're discussing our budget, and there's this,
Let's actually introduce the topic. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I think we haven't seen each other. We haven't been together for a while, and this is what happens. Just so much to discuss. But the real reason why
having a pink drink.
Yes, actually, let's talk about this. We had Sekai on the show, and for a lot of you who don't know this, but
she's an entrepreneur in her own right.
It's her daughter, actually, who makes Oriental hibiscus tea, and it's got all sorts of flavors. And I thought, let me make an iced tea with it, and it's just delightful, delicious. And that's what I'm having. He's having water. You could have joined me.
I'm having water. I'm taking it easy after a jolly in Big Falls. So.
Well, what I'm loving about being back here is, it's just, I think we're past the worst of winter. We're actually having, these wonderful sunny days. And,
that's actually true.
And, so you typically have white wine a little bit chilled, and I'm having a South African Chenin Blanc that's award-winning called Babylon Storen that a friend of mine highly recommended, and it's actually quite good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, tell us whether or not you had
you approve of Tinashe having a pink drink.
Yeah,
I tasted it. It's actually quite nice.
It is, right?
I'm now trusting your brewing expertise after my bad experience
with the Malawi Shandy.
With the Malawi Shandy in the Vic Falls.
In Vic Falls, right?
He's just generally got a very sensitive alimentary canal. And he has to be very fussy about what he consumes. Unlike me.
But he's still consuming mine.
Yeah, exactly. A lot. It says something about his brew because I didn't have any issues whenever I partook of what Tinashe had prepared.
You should try my cooking.
Let's just leave it there.
And my
well, he would demand a well done steak, and it would be sacrilegious to make
gosh.
like.
But I tried. It was too red, the one that I tried in Big Falls with this guy.
And he had a medium tomahawk.
Okay. Did you?
Yeah. But he enjoyed it.
So for the first time, you tested
the cow.
The cow.
I did. But you see what I did?
How was it?
No, it was really, I enjoyed it. But you see what I did? I ate the outer side, and when I got into like the center, I'm like, gosh, this is too red.
That's the juice of it.
This is too red.
It's always about the juice.
And I couldn't say no.
Then I said, no, you can take over and finish. But it was really...
I devoured it. It was phenomenal.
I would say for the first time, actually experienced the taste of
the juices.
Yeah.
The juices.
Yeah.
And not the ash.
The juices.
Yes, the delightful juices.
Exactly. what it's
That's
about.
that's what stake is
So,
about.
guys, peer pressure.
We
is
are
there.
ardent. We are ardent.
And we even
steak
went
lovers.
to a craft beer.
Yeah, he had a
place.
ginger craft beer.
Then I had a stone ginger beer.
Okay. And
Yeah.
how was it?
No, it was just like a normal stony, but for 10 times more.
Punch.
Price. No.
Oh, the
because
price! Yeah.
It felt like
that's
such
the
a
thing
waste.
about Victoria Falls, right?
Yeah.
No, they
But anyway.
bludgeon your wallet.
So what we want to do is we actually want to discuss the budget, and I think that preamble almost tells you our view on government and where government should be, and it's with those particular lens that we actually study the government. So there is a social contract between the citizens and the government and the executive. And the social contract is that we will take care of you. There are certain things that you've given up, certain rights that you've given up, and you've given them up to an executive. And that executive then says, oh, okay, we will take care of you, common goods or public goods, some would like to say. And this is what we're going to do with your taxes. And this is how we're going to spend your taxes and protect you and ensure that there's prosperity. So that's
Mr. John Locke would be so impressed by the way you've described the social contract.
not that I'm Lockean, but I think that's the premise in which we have the Libertarian.
Okay, I'm not gonna. It's.
Okay, that's okay, guys. Let's move on.
Okay, so let's discuss the current government, right?
The current budget.
Well, government actually, because what it has done is
Leviathan. Yes, that's how you pronounce it.
Leviathan.
Okay. Yeah,
that's true. So let's discuss the current government, right? So it has come to us, and it has said that. So previously, when they presented the government
the budget
in November of 2013, which was for 2024, it was a 9 billion. When you convert it into US dollars, it was a $9 billion US dollar budget. They've now presented a midterm budget, and it's now about 6.5 billion US dollars using the exchange rate that they've used, right? So where I want to start with you guys is, what does this tell us? Is this the reality, or is this a concession by the government that things are not well? Because they were planning on getting as much as 9 billion in revenue, but now they think that they will get to 6.5. Is this our reality, and is this an admission of the problems that we have as a state, or is this just hocus pocus monetary issues?
Look, that's a great question, and I think one of the challenges that I have, and I think anyone looking at this budget will have, just trying to digest it, is you basically looked at a bunch of local currency numbers and you converted them at a particular rate, but we don't know actually the timing of the revenue collection and the timing of the expenditures, which can have a material impact on the exchange rate that you ought to use to convert them into US dollars, and what those US dollar numbers will be. So part of the challenge is actually just looking at those numbers and trying to compare them to last year, and actually trying to deduce the things that you've deduced, that it's come from 9 billion to 6.5. Is that actually the case? Well,
that's the question I'm asking you.
Because the state does not share with us. This is exactly how much we spent in US dollars. This is how much we collected in US dollars, and this is our local currency receipts, the timing of them, so that we can actually convert them at the appropriate rates. Because if you think about a budget, it's different from a balance sheet in that a balance sheet is just a snapshot of on a particular day, right? Whereas the budget actually happens over 6 months in this instance, right? Mm-hmm. And it makes a really big difference when, if 70% of the spending is in the first 3 months, then it makes a huge difference which rate you know.
Okay, so Rivaro, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sense.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. That
so we don't have the answer.
So if we take
And
your
I'm
analysis
asking you-
at face value,
Yeah.
then we can conclude that the economy has shrunk, that the government is expecting to collect less, and that, you know.
Or was the 9 billion over ambitious anyway?
No, but okay, so if we zoom out a little bit and we just look at it from a macroeconomic, at a high level, coming into 2024, there were three major headwinds that are affecting us as a country. Mm-hmm. So number one, you have the drought, you know, which has, you know, and even in the budget they speak to a contraction of more than 20% in the agricultural sector, right? That's a big economic headwind. The second one is commodity prices. You saw, you know, platinum prices taking a huge beating, and the same is true of other commodities where we are a significant exporter. So that significantly reduces export revenues and whatever government is collecting in terms of royalties and the taxes from those mines. So that's a significant headwind. And then the other phenomenon that we are alive to is that the informal sector is stealing market share from the formal sector, and government gets most of its revenues from
a
the
shrinking tax base.
So
what I'm hearing is
yeah.
just a combination of two.
Yeah.
It's over ambition in November, and reality is starting to sink in, but also the reality that actually the base is shrinking. Now, to Uranga, I want to again focus on that big number because it helps us to understand what is actually going into the coffers of government. When you think of $6.5 billion that they think that they will get in terms of revenue, and you look at what they've collected so far, they've collected about $2 billion so far. This is June. So is that not still over ambitious? Just looking at 6.5 that they think they will, that's the target that they think they will hit by the end of the year. But it was a very slow first quarter. Second quarter was a little bit better. But right now, when you look at what they've collected, it's about $2 billion. If you're generous, you could say $2.5 billion. Are they still going to get to 6.5 or $6 billion that they think they'll get to?
Very unlikely. So you'd expect Q3 and Q4 to get even tougher. So we were probably feeling the effects of the headwinds that we foresaw, say Q4 of 2023, but we didn't realize the extent of the harm that it will have onto the economy. Now we are getting into the Q3, going to Q4. Reality is actually beginning to hit home hard, and it's very unlikely that we'll get numbers closer to that. But you see that even in terms of the economic GDP projections, now reduced to 2%. And even when you look at the 2% again, I say, is it likely to happen?
Yeah, this is 2% on a budget of 6.5%.
Yes.
So the question I have is, do you think that government revenue will get us to somewhere close enough to 6.5?
It's very unlikely. I don't think we'll collect more than what we have collected so far.
Okay. So we're likely to be around 4
billion.
billion.
Around 4 years.
Okay. So this poses another big question that I have for you, Shumba. It's, if you think about it, they've presented a 6.5 billion budget, but half year they've already told us that the budget deficit is actually 13%, about 13 to 14%, right? That's huge if you think about it.
Yeah.
And yet they say by the end of the year, they will reduce the budget deficit from 13% right down to 1.3%, which means that from that 6.5 billion, they are hoping that they will make a lot more money in the next two.
Or maybe they'll cut.
Well, this is it's a philosophical, because I know you like philosophical arguments. Are they making a deduction on inflation rate? Because that's the only way you could reduce.
Yep.
And you could say, well, we spent all this money that we didn't have, but it's going to be inflated away. It was at a rate of 13.4, but by the time we get to the end of the year, we as government actually think that the rate will be somewhere around 20. So we close that gap, and we'll see you guys next year. And that's how we will reduce the deficit.
I think.
Let me get your thoughts on that.
So I've been looking at these budgets for for some time, over the years. I think we all have. And one of the things that we can say with very high conviction is that forward-looking statements in budget reviews or in budget announcements from the government, they're just telling us what their wishes are. They are not reliable forecasts of what's actually going to happen. They haven't been, as far as I can remember. So, I think that they're just simply sharing with us their wishes that, they'll close the deficit or reduce it significantly. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know that it's a plausible thesis that inflation can close the deficit, because I don't see the local currency gaining market share. If anything, looking at the performance of the local currency since the ZiG was launched on the 5th of April, I would say that the local currency is likely to lose market share in the second half of this year.
So I would actually say, in addition to being their wish, I would be more cynical and say I think some of these figures are actually thumbs up. So they're actually starting from the expense side. So you're getting all this wish list of expenditure from government and departments and ministries. So maybe they were looking to spend the 6 billion. Now you are sitting there in the treasury, you're part of the planning department. You're saying, okay, they want to spend 6 billion.
So we need to raise 6 billion.
Yes, we need to raise 6 billion. How? Then we just dream of some numbers. Because I think there's been some consistency. I mean, there's been some consistency in terms of how there's always this disparity. But one thing that is almost certain is they'll get very close to the budgeted expenditure.
I like that, because that's where I'm actually trying to direct the conversation so that our audience is very clear.
So their projections on the expenditure side will be very close to reality. If anything, it might actually be much bigger. But almost always on the revenue side.
So if we take Ranga's thinking, which I quite like, because actually what we want to do, and this will be for the benefit of the audience, is actually to show them that actually this government wanted to spend $9 billion. Treasury has come back and said, guys, I don't think that's feasible. Let's put it down to 6.5, right? But even that 6.5, when you look at the revenue side, what they've collected already after the year, and what they're more likely to collect by the end of the year, they're more likely to collect about $4 billion. So you still have a deficit,
a huge deficit,
minimum deficit of about $2.5 billion. Max could be they will still spend $9 billion. And how you're able to do that from an economic perspective is inflation.
Yeah, but this is the thing.
So the numbers will only make sense and they will balance out by the end of the year if you introduce inflation in the whole economy.
So there's the inflation,
so
but also, there's the issue of the condonation deal that always comes up every year. So I think they've come up with some formula where outside of the budgeted resources, they would find ways of meeting the expenditures that they've always wanted. So they will tell you maybe 2-3 years down the line that, you know what, in fact, we actually collected 3 billion and we still spent 6.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, this is.
Yeah, but where I'll push back on the inflation argument, I think that's true in a scenario in which the local currency has a lot of market share. So in a scenario where the market share of the local currency is 80%, you double money supply, you have 100% inflation, and Tinashe's thesis pans out. But on a bad day, the local currency is on 10% market share. On a good day, maybe 20%, right? And the very act of introducing inflation.
Okay, so maybe let's make it very clear. As far as government revenue is concerned, actually they get more of their revenue in local currency.
Yeah, well,
than in US dollars. So we're not talking about GDP. We're talking about government revenue and expenditure.
Yeah.
And when you look at revenue and expenditure, the bulk of it is actually in local currency.
Yeah, but
it was true in Zim dollar. It's also true in ZiG. In fact, they've actually gone as far as saying that 50% of their revenue that they're going to ask from us.
Yeah.
It has to be in the local currency. So we're looking at their balance sheet and their income statement. And their balance sheet and income statement is almost 50-50 US dollars and local currency.
Yeah, but you see, but the numbers that we're speaking to are US dollar numbers, right?
So no, we're speaking to US dollar numbers so that it makes sense to our audience. If
Yeah.
we started talking in ZiG,
then it doesn't make any sense.
it doesn't
But what I'm
make
saying-
any sense whatsoever.
But what I'm saying,
if we convert it to US
in
dollars,
real terms,
then people can understand.
In real terms, you can. In real terms, the spending, you can't. Inflation can't pay for government expenditure in a market in which the local currency has small market share.
It actually does. Because what is inflation? It's a tax, right?
It's a wealth transfer. Yeah, it's a tax.
It's a transfer. And that's what we're saying. That there will be a significant transfer because what they actually want is they want to spend 6.5. But what is real in the real economy can only get to 4 billion. So how are they going to cover the difference? And we're saying in the real economy, to your point, is that there will be a wealth transfer.
Yeah,
But there has to be a wealth because they're still going to spend 6.5 billion.
So
No matter what you do.
So that wealth transfer, for it to actually be viable, right? You have to have the local currency having significant market share, right? So if you look at the banking sector today, most of the balances are actually in hard currency, not local currency, and people are reticent to hold local currency because they don't have faith and confidence in it. So how are they going to increase the share of local currency?
What in the financial services sector? So how you increase the share could be through TBs. Because remember we said it's a wealth transfer.
Yeah.
So a TB is a very good way in which the wealth transfer happens, where you issue out these TBs in US dollars and you give it to the financial services sector, right? And they will discount them, but we all know that that money will never be paid. So the financial services sector holds on to these TBs, some with as long dated as 2042, but we all know that but eventually when they're paid out, they're not going to be paid to the dollar that they were, the real dollar that it was worth at the beginning of the year today. So that's the wealth transfer. The wealth transfer is I'm giving you paper and I'm long dating it to 2042 so that by the time you get it, it's worthless. But I got the value today.
I feel like we're at the precipice. We're in danger of getting into a rabbit hole. But there's a graph that I want to discuss that captured my imagination in the midterm budget, which speaks to the GDP growth forecast. And it talked about global GDP growth.
Before we get into that, do you now agree that there is wealth transfer and how government does the wealth transfer is through its long-dated paper?
Yeah, the reason why I said we're at risk of getting into a rabbit hole is because I don't agree. I
disagree.
I don't think that's.
Because actually, we want to exhaust it, and please, in the comment section, please disagree or agree, and we can have this conversation because it's very important that people understand how the wealth transfer actually happens.
Yeah. So the reality on the ground is that we are mostly dollarized, right? Our economy is 80% plus USD. And it's because there's we don't have faith and confidence in the local currency, and I think that it's a hard ask to actually grow that local currency market share. And because these wealth transfers that you speak to have happened before, people have lost money. I think the posture of most economic players is to actually insulate themselves from such wealth transfers.
Rufaro, you're a market player. Are there TBs in this market that have 10-year, 20-year tenures?
Yes, they are.
And are those TBs in US dollars?
Absolutely.
Do you believe that government will be able to pay in US dollars in 10, 20 years' time?
Well, look, I don't have a crystal ball.
Okay, what do you think?
So they're making a promise that they'll pay in USDs. Look, it's a long time. 10 years from now, anything can happen. But based on what we have seen so far, I think generally government paper is being rolled over. So basically it means government is not paid, it's actually pushed.
Kick the can down the road.
Yeah, kick the can down the road.
That's the wealth transfer. That's all we're saying.
So,
that's the wealth transfer.
Yeah, but you see, okay, so let's.
But eventually, it has to be paid at some point, or maybe we hope it will be paid.
But let's just let's delve into some of the weeds a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. So there are treasury bills that are already out there in the world, yeah. Mm. And then so that wealth transfer has already happened, right? If you're holding this paper and you're at risk that either it might be rolled over or you might be issued with local currency, or there's a whole there are a bunch of unpleasant scenarios that are possible in your future if you're holding this paper. Mm-hmm. But the question really is, going forward to pay bills, to what extent can the state actually issue new paper to get goods and services? You see, this is where I'm saying that the posture of most of the market is to insulate themselves from that, right? And so, just to put it plainly, it's your businesses out there are saying, I'd rather be paid in hard currency. I'm not, I'm going to limit my exposure to local currency receipts. So in an environment where that's the prevailing attitude,
okay, so
doing a wealth transfer is then quite difficult.
Well, it's not difficult, but I think that you raise a very important question, which I want us to actually get into, which is what the financial services actually finds itself in, which is a quagmire where you're in this place where you have tons of local currency piling up, mm-hmm. right? And if you don't use it up, the central bank takes it at 0%. Then you have government which will then come and say, hey, by the way, I'll give you 18%. If you don't take my paper, sure. If you don't want to take my paper, that's fine. The central bank will still take it at 0%. Mm-hmm. But if you take my paper, it will be at 18%. So you're still making a loss, mm-hmm. but it's a better loss. You're thinking, well, 18%, it's okay. Mm-hmm. So you end up, that's how government paper ends up being bought by the financial services sector. That's number one. Number two is the ability to discount the paper. So somebody might say, well, it's okay, I'll be paid in 10, 20 years' time, but I got this paper at a heavy discount. So it was the coupon or face value, it was $1, but somebody sold it to me at 50 cents because they wanted the 50 cents today. They were not going to wait for 10 years. Mm-hmm. But I'm better off because now my yield is very high. I've got a 60-something% yield.
Yeah. That's an academic way of looking at it, because you on paper, your yield is fantastic.
But the transfer has already happened. The point I'm just trying to make mm-hmm. is the wealth transfer has already happened. Because there was a guy who supplied goods to government, mm-hmm. was paid in TBs, went onto the market, discounted the TBs, and some guy held on to the paper for 10, 20 years, even though his yield was at 50 or whatever, but it was purely academic.
The wealth transfer happens when the TB is issued. What happens in the secondary market is immaterial.
So they're issuing TBs.
Yeah, but
so if you accept that the wealth transfer is happening,
let's have
they're already issuing TBs today.
Let's have a conversation about new TBs, right? And the market's appetite for new TBs. You see, this is where I'm pushing back to say that the appetite in the market for government TBs is incredibly constrained.
That's not
so we in the capital markets will tell you that the only institutions that are buying government paper are institutions that where it's a statutory requirement to meet their regulatory obligations, or they are quasi-government institutions in the first instance. The people who can allocate capital freely won't touch that paper with a budget.
But also financial institutions sometimes buy paper for trading.
But they're regulated, right?
Yeah, for trading purposes, right? I mean, like you can make some money, some margins from there. And also they they are regulated, and it's probably good on their balance sheet compared to other paper that is there. Because remember, financial institutions, they've got a very limited universe of assets.
But they're buying them because they're regulated. They're not.
Yes.
If they could allocate capital freely, they wouldn't buy any.
You know what, Rufaro, you clearly stated the wealth transfer happens at issuance.
Yes, 100%.
And as long as government has issued a TV, and as long as someone has got those TVs, the wealth transfer has already happened. What then happens after that?
It's immaterial.
It's immaterial.
We're in agreement there.
So government has issued TVs.
Yeah. So where we differ,
but it's not like
continued capacity to issue into the market.
But the primary
value. That's what. This is where I'm pushing back.
But the primary recipient is not like they're going to lose any value. There's no value loss on their part, because I think for most of government suppliers, obviously, they are loading a huge margin on the invoices anyway. So the wealth transfer is not between government and this particular individual entity. It's actually between government and its citizens.
And the taxpayer.
That's
That's actually brilliant.
Yeah.
So what's happening is, and this is the vicious cycle we then get into, because anyone who's supplying government, that's how you see these TVs that are issued 1.6 billion and these ridiculous amounts. It's because people have already loaded in their margins. So government knows that I have to pay in TVs, but nobody's going to accept my TVs unless they've loaded their margins. So every supplier, every government contractor is doing the same. And then the wealth transfer happens between the two of them, but eventually it's borne by the taxpayer.
Yes, eventually it's borne by the taxpayer. And it's similar to a local currency when you have printing. And the other similarity is that because the local currency previously has lost so much value, people then shun it and it loses market share. And then your capacity to actually pay for things with local currency becomes severely constrained. And the same is true of TBs, right? As long as you are issuing them out profligately, right? And the discounts get steeper and steeper and steeper. At some point, no one will want to touch them. So I'm saying the capacity, we're in agreement in terms of the nature of the wealth transfer. I'm just making the case that the government's capacity to continue to pay its bills with TBs is not infinite. In fact, actually, the more they issue and the higher the discounts become, the smaller the market is that's willing to accept them.
I'm willing to accept that argument, but the flip side is there's another way in which they can do it, which is they force the local currency on you. So we government overdraft with the central bank. So if they come onto the market, so the first thing that they'll do is they will say, okay, I'm going to pay you in TBs. And then now there's pushback. People don't want the TBs anymore because there's a limit to how much you can. And then they'll say, oh yeah, sure, okay, you don't want me to pay you in TBs, but I can give you in local currency. Because remember, there was already a deficit. In the last 6 months, there's a budget deficit of around 13%. And that deficit, how has that deficit been funded? It's by printing local currency. And somebody's willing to take that local currency.
Until they're not. You see, that's the point I'm trying to make. That there's a limit to how much you can print. Whether you're printing local currency or you're printing TBs.
So what we know is so far, the last 6 months, people have been taking the local currency. And what we know is the rest of the year, because we're focusing on 2024, people will take that local currency. And people will take those TBs.
As long as they have utility. You see, if you look at our history, right, and I'm going to take us back to 2008 going into 2009, right? It's not like the government of the day then thought it was a great idea to completely abandon the local currency, right? It was just printed into oblivion until nobody wanted to accept it, right? And it's not in the government. So if it was up to the government, then, the local currency would have persisted.
Okay, so the last local currency, when was it introduced?
On the 5th of April.
No. Well, not this. This is the present.
Yeah.
But the last one.
2019?
2019.
Yes.
How long did it last? 5 years.
No, but
That's the point I'm trying to make.
Zimbabweans have a learning curve.
Even if you say there's a learning curve.
Yeah.
But it's going to be the next 3 years. It's not going to be in the next 6 months.
It just depends on how aggressively.
So are you guys already betting on Zig failing?
we're saying it's inevitable. Zig will fail.
Okay.
But
I'm not saying it's inevitable. I mean, we're not saying the same thing. What I will say, though, is that as of today, it's failing.
But that's his argument. That's your argument.
So
Zig is not failing.
So how long are you giving it? I mean, how much more months before?
Oh, no. I actually think that Zig is going to be with us for another maybe 5 years.
Okay.
Or if I'm generous, I think just before the elections, because I think when you then have elections, then that's when the value, there's absolutely nothing. But I think that for the next 4 years, Zig is going to be with us.
And what will it take for it to be stabilized? And
No, it's never going to stabilize. It's going to continuously lose value. So if we say when it was introduced, which was in April, this year, 2024, it had 100% value. By 2028, it will have 2% value. So it's going to lose, close to 98% of its value in the next 4 years. That's my prediction.
So I've got a different take. I think,
please go ahead.
Firstly, we're discussing a storm in a teacup, right? The local currency has less than 20% market share. It has at most 20% market share on a good day. On a bad day, it's got 10% or less market share. And I don't think its market share is growing.
But in the supermarket, they're not seeing more Zig.
So in fact, I love that you bring up the supermarkets. I'll tell you something. We were discussing this earlier, and I think this is it's fascinating and frightening at the same time. When I look at the cost in supermarkets of imported goods, right? And bear in mind, so the official rate is, call it 13.7. The supermarkets are allowed to trade at 14.9. The real rate on the power market is 22, 23, right? And so if you actually use the real rate to price supermarket goods, they're actually cheaper than they are in South Africa, which I can't remember the last time that was true. Zim has always been much more expensive. So what that tells me, number one, it's not sustainable. And and how will this manifest? If we don't change the exchange rate regime and the fungibility of Zig, you're going to walk into a supermarket in the next several weeks or couple of months, and you're just going to find a dearth of these imported goods because they won't be able to replace them. Because if you apply your mind to it, they're selling this imported good at below cost. They get Zig. They're not being allocated Zig at the bank at 13.7. Their suppliers are not able to supply them that product at 13.7, so it doesn't get replaced. And you go back to empty shelves.
But
so this is not sustainable.
Just, injecting 50 million onto the interbank. Isn't it there just to
That's a panacea? That's going to solve all our problems?
The auction used to be 40 million.
Because according to their statement, they've been a player and they've watched how, the demand supply mechanism was working there. And they believe that the 50 million will come and...
it's going to make a difference. You see, okay, we can get into that a little bit because I think it's interesting. I don't know, we can segue out, if the anchor allows us.
I'm going to pack that and we're going to get to it. I just want us to deal with some of because this is a midterm budget review. And there's something that you had already started, which is looking at the GDP growth. So we've looked at, just to refocus again, what we did is we looked at the numbers and we're saying that it's unsustainable. There's no way that government is going to get to 6.5. But using the 6.5, they've actually said that it will be buttressed by economic growth of 2%. So I want to get to that particular point, that the 2% growth. Do you see it as real? Do you think that it's a figment of their imagination?
I'm highly skeptical about achieving 2% growth this year, given the headwinds with the drought, with commodity prices, with the shrinking formal sector. Frankly, I suspect the government is actually going to struggle to pay its bills in the second half of this year. So I think that's I'm skeptical that we'll achieve positive economic growth this year. But one of the reasons why that graph that you're looking at I found quite fascinating maybe we can zoom out a little bit and think about it philosophically, is, if you look at, the relative growth rates in different parts of the world, and the graph that is in the midterm review is for 2023 and this year. But it's, relatively those numbers are in those proportions over the last 5-10 years, right? And, sub-Saharan Africa has 62% of the world's poorest people. So we really need to be growing much faster if we aspire to emancipate people from poverty, right? And yet you'll find at 2%, we're actually growing slower if we achieve 2% than the world's biggest economy, which is actually already rich. So there's something, and this has been true for the longest time going backwards when you compare us to
China.
China.
I think they're looking at drought. So they're saying, well, it's an aberration. It's an aberration because we suffered a real, El Nino-induced drought.
Yeah.
So it's an aberration.
Yeah,
and
but
even with that aberration, we're still
growing slower than China, right? China's a $17 trillion economy. It's
it's
considered developed.
It's actually said in this day and age that we have got an economy that whose growth is hinged on
the weather.
On the weather, on the weather. Yet your expenses, you still have to incur them, irrespective of the
whether
weather.
it rains or not.
In fact, your expenses actually tends to grow much higher when you've got adverse weather patterns. It's actually we can't keep on this track without maybe just reflecting on what we need to do.
What does it mean?
Yeah, what does it
so
mean?
So the question for you,
we are
Ranga,
able to
is
sustain ourselves beyond.
There's this reality that the 2% growth is buttressed on negative growth in agriculture at 21%, but everything else seems to be growing. In fact, the highest growth there that I see,
I hope it's not
12%,
retail and distribution.
No, accommodation and food services.
Okay.
They actually think that that's going to grow at around 12%, and then information and communications will grow at 11%. But they seem not to be a pass-through. So if agriculture is not growing, I would have assumed that manufacturing would also be negative. I would assume that almost, the value chain would be negative. And it means that we're actually importing more. And if we're importing, importations have a negative impact on our GDP. But from their numbers, it's only agriculture. Is this too ambitious, or is this the reality of our economy? Because if it is the reality of our economy, then we're able to absorb agricultural shocks. That's what it's telling me.
I've got some problems with those numbers, and it tends to happen every time you see a negative number in agriculture. I don't know what you call it in accounting when the numbers are not balancing, then you just create some number to make sure.
Fudging.
No.
Creative accounting.
Yeah, maybe it's a balancing figure. Yeah, it's a balancing figure. So sometimes you see it on.
So they wanted 2%.
Yes.
And then they had negative growth in agriculture. Then
go through history. Whenever we've got a negative outturn on agriculture, there's always a very fun number. So it, in some year it could be electricity. And I think in other years there's been financial services growing by 16%. But you see, when you look at the makeup of our economy, agriculture still plays a very central role to a point that, if it's not the issue to do with employment, it's also even in terms of resource allocation, even at national level. So it means all those things that you are looking at, ICT and accommodation, etc., their growth is likely to be constrained because all resources are going to be channeled towards feeding the people, right? And don't forget that when with every year, agriculture is pre-funded. So actually, when you've got it's a negative growth. But in terms of the resources that were put into agriculture, the number, I don't think it changed
We can assume that it's the same.
Yeah, the same amount of money that was actually allocated to drought-proofing and funding farmers, but the outturn is down some, what number do you have there?
Negative 21%.
Negative 21. But in terms of the resource allocation from the fiscals, that number did not reduce in line with that expectation. So what does it mean? It means in terms of resource allocation, agriculture continues to take away from other potential, from other sectors, but yet whenever there's a drought, the outturn is negative. So I wouldn't really, I'm not seeing any ICT growing that warrants that warrants those like 11% growth and etc. So I'm actually looking at those ICT and the accommodation that you're spoken about as balancing numbers that have just been put there to plug some hole. So I'm always looking at agriculture. I'm looking at mining. I'm looking at maybe manufacturing, retail, distribution, whatever. Anything else down the line.
Balancing numbers.
Yeah, they're balancing numbers for me.
Rufaro, another key factor. So we're just distilling the big major items that people need to be worried about. We look at tax and what has actually happened to tax. And over time, it has actually changed, the complexion of tax and where we're actually getting most of our money. In terms of VAT now, it's now 25%, and payee is now 20%. And then IMTT is now down to 3.4%. This used to be as high as 60%, but for the longest it was around 11%. But this has now come down to 3.4%.
Yeah, so I want to comment on the IMTT,
please.
And you see, this is incentives drive economic behavior. So, and this is one of the major reasons, in my view, that the informal sector is stealing market share from the formal sector, because if you're spending 2% just to move money around, right? If you think about the retail food and grocery business, that is a very low margin business for the most part. 2% is huge, right? So, how do you compete with a guy who's not paying that 2%? And the answer to that question is you don't. You just lose market share to them. And this is why people prefer to transact with green notes instead of through the formal banking channels, whether with USD or...
Please expand on this, because I think the audience, some may not actually understand this, that when you're taxed 2%, if you think about it, a round trip...
It's 4%.
It's 4%. So if VAT is 15%, it's now, 19%.
Yeah. Well, okay. If you're for one-way transaction, it's 17. But that's still, it's huge, right? And then there's a guy in the informal sector who's not paying any of that, right? How do you compete in the formal sector? So I think there's a philosophical challenge in the way Treasury looks at it.
Okay, so
So
again, let's distill it. Let's say there's a good that's moving from a primary producer right through to a tertiary producer, and it's within the chain you have 4 or 5 people, and somebody transfers money as a primary producer to a manufacturer. That's 2%, and then the manufacturer transfers money to someone else. That's another 2%, until it finally gets to the consumer. How many times?
Well, it's the consumer actually the money's moving in that opposite direction. But that's 2%.
2%. You could easily come to 6-8%.
It's a lot of money, and
And in the informal sector, you then you don't
have that.
Is not there.
You don't have that at all.
So VAT is not there as well.
Yeah. So the challenge, the way I see it is, Treasury looks at the pie, and they say, well, I'm currently getting $100. I need to be getting $120, right? And I think for them the low-hanging fruit is just to either increase an existing tax or introduce a new one, like they did with IMTT 6-7 years ago. But that actually, the way in economic theory that taxes work is if you, for any particular sized pie, if you increase the taxes, the pie actually shrinks. And the taxman actually ends up collecting less in tax. The best way to actually increase tax revenues is to make the pie bigger.
So, Ranga, because this is actually a philosophical argument, and I like the way you've actually put it across. Today you're cooking, boss.
There must be something in that white
That's
wine.
the Shanine.
Yes, but you raise a very big philosophical argument, which is between indirect tax and direct tax. So when you see a government coming through with indirect taxes, it means that there's something fundamentally wrong with your economy, but usually it's a short-term measure. So when you introduce an indirect tax, you're saying that I need to plug in a gap, and at most this tax should be there for about maybe a year or 2 years, because it's a consumptive indirect tax. I introduce it, but the minute I introduce it, I should also acknowledge that consumptive patterns are going to change. People are going to change their behavior because of my indirect tax. Whereas if you tax, if it's a direct tax, this is actually long. It means that the economy has actually grown. So if you look at corporate tax, which is a direct tax, right? If there's a lot more investment, corporate tax, you keep it at 15% or 20%, whatever it is. As the pie gets bigger, you just grow with it. And what we've seen over the last 15 years, especially between dollarization and now, is that our tax system, our tax regime has actually shifted. It has shifted from direct taxation, which used to be the big headline items, and into indirect tax. But indirect tax, at most, you can squeeze 2 years out of them. 6, 7 years, people will shift their behavior. What is wrong? And this is basic. I mean, you don't need to be a student of economics to understand this. But guys in Treasury, I'm sure, they know this. Why are they sticking with IMTT?
That's a big question. And, the negatives far outweigh any positives from the tax. So it's now contributing such a small figure to the total overall tax number, but the negative vibe around it is actually quite huge. And the problem with indirect tax is it actually has got a direct impact on the potential of direct taxes, because it means, so if people are avoiding IMTT, it means you are actually feeding the underground economy, the informal sector. You are actually moving business away from
and moving money away from the financial services.
From the financial services to the informal, and more and more people are looking for ways of avoiding it, because direct tax is directly related to your production and the productive activities. So you have no problem paying more corporate tax. So the percentage hasn't changed. If you are having to pay more dollar amount of corporate tax, it's because
They're doing well.
They are doing well. So you don't have any problem with that. But with an indirect tax like IMTT, you have to pay it irrespective of your production or productive capacity. So it's a big surprise. I think the winner is any kind of policies that encourages business to.
And we saw a bit of that. I think withholding tax for the informal sector, they've now reduced it to about 5%. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a positive. But I think, just to reiterate Ranga's point and just, speak to something that is huge that we don't often discuss, is if we make the formal sector shrink and we make the formal financial services sector shrink, one of the reasons that's really holding back growth of the Zimbabwean economy is the lack of credit, right? We have this incredibly thriving construction sector right now in a market where almost nobody can get a mortgage. Can you imagine what would be happening in construction if you could walk into your bank, present your pay slip, and get a 25, 30-year mortgage? Can you imagine the expansion that we would see in every other sector, from tourism to mining to manufacturing, if a bank if a company could go to a bank and borrow, to fund expansion and get a 5-10 year facility, right? We just don't see that happening, and it's because we've punished the formal sector so much that in this market today, you'll be lucky to get a facility from a bank that goes beyond 90 days. And so one of the reasons why we're stuck at anemic growth of 2-3% is because we don't have a functioning credit market.
Okay, so Ranga, you're a farmer, and this is something positive.
He identifies as a farmer. I
wouldn't. So, Ranga,
obviously, I expected Rufaro to...
They've removed VAT on livestock. Mm-hmm. Do you see that as a positive thing?
No, it's positive.
So why are you starting with the word no?
No, I mean, I was still trying to respond to Rufaro, who thinks that I just identify as a farmer. I'm a farmer, Rufaro. Yeah. There's a whole range of our farmers out there doing different things. Mm-hmm. So any incentives that sort of encourages production, I think is progress. I think it recognizes the fact that the farmers are, if they are less constrained by a burdening tax regime, they could possibly do more, expand their head, and be able to generate some more revenue. So it's something that we would want to see even across all other agricultural commodities, and have policies that sort of encourage farmers to expand production and also even invest. I think that aspect is important. Like you said, we can't be waiting for rains every time. So if farmers are able to sell, not burdened by huge tax burdens, then it means they are able to invest into their projects.
Yeah, and surely you shouldn't force people to go in the underground
and also I
economy.
Think the VAT on livestock was an asymmetric tax to the extent that it only affected
formal,
players in the formal sector. So what happens is, you're more expensive than the subsistence farmer and everybody playing in the informal space, and therefore your volumes shrink. And actually, so it's bad.
So they're only responding to it because it was negative.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It didn't have a snowball's chance of actually working, sadly.
Okay, so we've got a number of questions. An important one is the rate of conversion that central bank, well, not central bank, but Treasury used. This is, when you look at the budget, when it was done, it was about $58 trillion, right? And now it's 87. And if you think about the conversion rate that they've used, it's somewhere around 663. Where are they getting the rate?
Well, I have no idea, but the rate is a problem for everyone. And it's always, anyway, these numbers are confusing if you really want to look at them.
If you use Zim dollar, it's confusing. That's why we have to distill it into US dollars.
Into US dollars, and then be able to make proper comparisons. But otherwise, that movement from Zim dollar to Zig and whatever, it just creates a
lot of confusion there.
Confusion, distortion, and also an opportunity for leakages. So, when there's a changeover in currency, everything's just murky.
Okay. So the other two things that we want to look at is when you look at the government run rate at this so far with the budget, it's about 44%. So they think that they are well within their targets. But if you look at certain
run rate, you mean?
How much money they've used at half year.
Okay. So you're looking at the expenditure side, not the revenue side. Okay.
Yeah. The expenditure side is about 44%. When you compare expenditure and revenue, they've got a deficit of about 13%.
Okay.
But so the question is, certain ministries.
It's we.
Certain ministries, it's around 240%. So the roads, they've spent all that was allocated, and we can see the roads. We can see the roads. Do you think that that's a positive thing or it's a negative thing?
Look, I think building infrastructure is a positive thing. What I find questionable is the way it's been funded. I don't see us raising long-term debt instruments to fund it. These are projects with a useful life that should be measured in decades, and I don't see any financing activity that is
congruent. Yeah.
But the international capital markets don't have appetite for Zim paper, so Zimbabwean paper, not Zim papers. So look, obviously the negative impact of that has been the rate at which the local currency has been deteriorating because of money supply issues. But I like seeing most of these roads being paved, especially the western part of Harare, and I'm sure it's happening in other areas. Maybe I have not been there. And
you're not answering. His core issue is how it's actually funded.
No. So I'm saying I actually think they're alive to the fact that you need long-term project funding. But we know, like when Harare...
No, that's not the question. The question is, why are you not sticking to the budget? Because everything else, on average, every ministry is spending about 44%. But there's this one particular ministry where it is overshoot.
No, there was a special requirements. It's only...
No, it's not like the special requirement. It's not like they didn't know that SADC was going to happen in November.
You've got nothing to showcase from the Minister of Education to the SADC delegate.
Okay, so there are a number of issues I just need to cover. Suppliers are now owed about $200 million.
Yeah.
That hasn't been paid. What are your thoughts? Quick thoughts, because now we need to round up.
But they are still supplying, so it means it makes sense for them. When it comes to government suppliers, I really don't have any sympathy for them. It's not like they're in trouble.
No, we're just looking at it from if you go to your accountant and your accountant tells you that I haven't paid 200 million and 200 million is about 10-15% of my.
And I'm asking them, have they stopped supplying? No, they're still supplying us. Then they're happy. There must be some arrangement that is there between the supplier.
Well, they've loaded huge margins.
Exactly. So I think those ones are fine.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So we won't talk about that.
I think
then fuel was a big thing that was raised. I don't know what you guys think. So clearly, the amount of fuel that Zimra records that is actually passing through our border, and when we look at what's actually being consumed in the local market, there's a dip. So when they look at how much has been declared at the border as coming in, being supplied into the country, and what is actually consumed at the filling station, there's a huge disparity, meaning that there is huge corruption or, something is fundamentally wrong with the fuel sector. And they've come up with these new measures to ensure that it's highly fiscalized right at the filling station. So my question to you is, if there's this big leakage in an industry that is about 1.8 billion, how many more leakages do we have within the system that the Treasury just hasn't picked up on?
So the fuel sector is actually quite unique. I think from outside, you could actually see that it's a crime scene there. I mean, the rate at which new service stations are coming up, and even the price disparities. So you find some service stations selling at prices that are like 20% of the average in the marketplace. And every corner of the road, major road, like it's not just a Harare thing. Wherever you go across the country, like you are seeing a service station that is coming up. It's clearly an area where you won't be surprised if you hear that there's a lot of corruption and money laundering activities that is taking place. So I think the move to try and leave some tax at the port of entry. In my view, I think it was necessary. At least that should account for every liter of fuel that comes into this country. I mean, it's 1.8 billion. So probably what should the requirements or what we really need is probably much less than that. And the rest that we're just paying, well, us as
citizens.
is just going to feed the rent seekers. So I think it's progress. I don't know whether they're going to be effective in policing that, but it's one area. Also, given the fact that it's being protected, it's one of the few sectors where
it's highly protected.
It's highly protected, and the authorities are saying no. Yes, we love Zig and want Zig to be able to transact in anything but fuel. So certainly, at least that sector, there has to be some clarity.
So maybe, Rufaro?
Sure.
Just as a simpleton, when I try and fuel my car at any filling station, I can't swipe. I have to pay cash.
Yep.
What's the problem there? Why can't I swipe?
No, it's because...
why do I need to use cash?
That's a good question. Well, I think, first and foremost, local currency is not...
No, I'm not talking about...
swiping USDs.
Swiping USDs. I've got a USD account. Why can't I just, drive into a filling station and swipe USDs? Why do I need to pay cash?
That's a good question. You should, look, in a competitive
and
market
how is that
like
cash
ours...
accounted for? That's a very interesting question you're raising there.
But look, if you without impugning the good faith of the service station operators, if I was to wear their hat, right, I can get paid in cash, and whatever I do with that cash, I'm never paying this 2% IMTT. Yeah. On the other hand, if I, for tenacious convenience, get my bank to give me a swipe machine, every time you swipe for fuel, I lose 2%. Right? So if it's entirely up to me, right, I'm saying, okay, fine, I can make life for tenacious a little bit easier, and he can swipe, and I lose 2%, or I just collect cash and I never have to deal with this 2%. What is a rational economic agent going to do?
But unfortunately...
And they're protected, right? So they're allowed to do this, right? They're allowed to do this.
It's the only place where there's this dispensation. But what we're saying is, by giving them a dispensation, now you have these distortions, huge distortions, where government is the one that's actually suffering.
Yeah.
Because of, putting them in a particular...
It's the law of unintended consequences, right? So, bureaucrats dream up some regulation to solve problem A, and then they inadvertently create problem B, C, and D, right? It happens all the time everywhere in the world. And this is one of the reasons why we're ardent free market advocates of free markets. Because in a free market, the market figures it out. And you have the most efficient solutions,
distortions
winning. Yeah.
We had anecdotes where people used to argue, perhaps wrongly, but it was an anecdote that was used that, the number of filling station, and I remember Mangujga actually saying that the fuel that we're importing shows that the economy is growing. Well, now...
Well, it shows that, other interesting things are happening in our economy.
Distortions. I think it was more a reflection of distortions. And don't you think that's the teachable moment? Then when you see things that don't make any economic sense, that perhaps it's just a reflection of the distortions in our economy, and not that the underlying economy is growing.
Well, you always get what you incentivize. So if you, and the thing about, creating rules is in a very complex economy it's almost impossible to model out all the possible outcomes. So you have these distortions manifesting, and it only becomes clear years later. So I don't know where. Because of this midterm policy statement, somebody actually did the analysis with fuel, right? But how long has this been going on?
And when an economy is growing, we all see it, we all feel it. There's always the real feel that you sort of experience, everyone. So when you've got maybe one particular sector of the economy showing so much activity, and then you try to extrapolate that as reflecting the growth in the economy, I think there's a problem. Okay. Because if there's growth in the economy, you have to see it across the board. That's why I also feel that in addition to the fuel sector, I think one area that right now is being touted is just a reflection of the economic growth is the construction sector. But there is a problem there. Yeah.
It's a reflection
It's
of
a reflection
distortions.
of distortions of problems, especially after the point that Rufaro has raised that there's no mortgage financing. So all of a sudden there's a boom in construction, but the traditional funding mechanism of that activity is not there. So what is that telling you?
It's a capital. It's a capital allocation issue, right? If in a normal economy, people would reinvest in their businesses, they would find better yielding destinations for their capital. But in a place like Zimbabwe, right? If you generate a bunch of extra capital, and you don't want to break the law and ship the money out illegally, where are you going to deploy your capital where it's relatively safe from the chopping and changing in the regulatory environment?
So the last item I want you guys, because I think it's something that you're heavily involved in, the pension fund industry. They looked at the pension funds, and I think 50% of the pension funds are now defunct or are no longer running, and only 50% are, limping along, and a lot of it is invested in equities and property. Any comments on that?
Why am I not surprised? So a pension fund collects from industry. So the industry it's actually, so what's happening in the pension fund is a reflection of the underlying economy and the underlying industry. So you'd have a situation where the company could actually be deducting pensions, making pension deductions from their workers' salaries, but not remitting, because maybe the company's cash flows are in dire straits. So surely you are running a business, and of all these competing cash flow needs that you are looking at, what are the chances that you prioritize remitting the little cash that you have to the pension fund, when you can't pay for direct costs that are actually affecting your business on a day-to-day basis? So that this is just a reflection of.
And then the other thing is that people think about their pensions and the contributions to them not as a saving for retirement, which is the way you're supposed to think about it, and everyone else in the real world actually does. In Zim, because of our, the value lost between 2008 and 2009, people think about them as a tax, right? Because one of the primary reason why the pension funds lost money for pensioners is because of a wealth transfer where they were forced to hold this paper, that government paper, that became worthless, right? That's the reason why people who worked and contributed to a pension fund, for 40, 50 years, woke up in 2009 and their pensions just blew up. They weren't worth anything. So if you have an experience of that nature, right, are you going to be stoked about contributing a significant portion of your income to a pension?
No. Okay. And Ranga, but how is the insurance market is actually growing? So when you look at the gross premiums underwritten, that's actually growing. Is that a distortion or a reflection of the economy?
So maybe you might also want to look at the major lines. So maybe in this kind of environment, it's possible to see the motor vehicle business sort of growing.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think over the years we see quite an increase in vehicle imports. And also now, as people are worried about being able to replace their vehicles, you want to say, okay, fine, maybe let me insure it. So there is the third party, but some goes all the way to comprehensive. I'm not seeing it. So I think one area that was going to give me some comfort if that line was increasing, something like, say, life assurance. So
that's more or less dead.
It's dead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that and saving, investment, and pensions, all those things. So anything that promises a better future for everyone, and where you are asked to put aside some resources, I think generally the thinking is, you know what, with all these current distortions, you are most likely to wake up with nothing at the end of the day. So are you not better off maybe front-loading your expenses now, or maybe find some other form of saving?
Yeah, like identifying as a farmer.
Exactly. So I'm probably...
Okay, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear your thoughts. Let's continue the conversation. I think that in the next week or so, we would love to have the Ministry of Finance fundies, and then we push back on a number of issues. Let's hear your thoughts. Maybe there are those who think that this was a positive budget, or perhaps disagree with our analysis. That's always very welcome. I think we like pushing back. I think that's the other thing about the show, right? Is we're the show where we push back a lot.
Yeah, maybe just as a parting shot, as a producer, I'm excited that we have got 6,000 subscribers.
Oh, well done.
Yeah.
Well done, guys. Fantastic. That's good to hear. So, road to 10,000. Can we get there?
Certainly. We have to get there before the end of the year.
That's very ambitious.
Of course. It's doable.
Do you have a side hustle in treasury?
All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy your Friday and enjoy your weekend. Otherwise, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.